So we're going to talk about designing your retirement. In 2022, I retired somewhat prematurely because I'd had a software company and I was a physician. I was a physician in private practice, and then ultimately, for the last couple of years, moved and became an employed physician. And it became so impossible to take care of patients in a way that met my own personal standards. I decided I had to get out. Um, and what happened was I was on an REI trip in Alaska in a place called Wrangell St. Elias National Park. It's the southeast corner of Alaska, just above the Panhandle. It's the largest national park in the US, 6 times the size of Yellowstone. There are no trails and no roads. A plane comes in and drops you off, and then they come and they promise to pick you up at a predetermined date and time. We hike up this glacial, the valley, and there's a glacial river coming down. There are mountains on both sides. It's July. This was July 2022. The flowers were in full bloom, so the river is sort of lined with greenery and flowers. We hike up to a mountain pass, and I turn around and look back. And what I see is the river with this sort of necklace of green and colors along it. A little, and then immediately afterwards, you got this granite base, and then the granite mountains, and on top of the mountains is snow, and behind the mountains are glaciers for as far as you can see. And it was a blue sky. And I just like in that moment, all of a sudden I realized I was completely stress free. And that hadn't happened since I started my education. And I turned to the person next to me and I said, I'm going to quit my job. Um, got back to, I was in a one-man tent. I dictated a letter to my wife, couldn't send it because there was no cell phone communication. When I got back, I sent it out. I sent it out to my wife, and she immediately wrote back and said, "You've been a basket case since you started working for the hospital. You should quit." And I've been telling you this all along. And I sent it off and ultimately worked it out. And I quit my job. As soon as I quit, I have a blog, and I wrote an article on my blog. Basically, I'm going to retire. And my mantra in retirement is going to be, it is now my time. Before, I was taking care of my kids. I had 2 kids. My wife had her own professional career. I had my software company, which was really a hobby that earned me some money. So I was the tech support, the chief programmer, and everything else. And so I wasn't responsible for the software anymore. I wasn't responsible for my kids. I wasn't responsible for my patients. Anyway, I wrote the essay. It got picked up by Commonwealth Beacon. Somebody at Regis College, who runs their learning and retirement program, read it and said, "This would be a great talk. Why don't you come in 6 months and give us a lecture about retirement?" Now, at this point, I hadn't even retired. So immediately I said, "Oh my God, I better read the medical literature. I need to figure out what this retirement is all about." And that's what started me on this journey. And then when I gave the lecture 6 months later, I already had a lot of knowledge about retirement that I hadn't had. What I'm going to do is we're going to go through the scientific and medical literature. And what we're trying to answer is, what do I need to do to have a happy, healthy, and fulfilling retirement? So I go through the medical literature, basically trying to answer that question. And in doing that, we come up with these 6 evidence-based retirement objectives. And I'm going to show you the data that leads to each one of these. So everything I'm going to show you is going to make you either happier, healthier, and by healthier, I mean less disease, increased longevity, or a sense of fulfilled. And then after we go through the evidence for each one of these, I'll show you what I did to try to implement that. And so this is the strategic retirement plan. There's 6 evidence-based objectives, and then I added my 4 personal objectives, and I'll show you how I did that. And then we create what's called a tactical plan. So for meaningful social relations, increase the number of meaningful social relations, I have a tactical plan of how I went about doing that, and we'll talk about that. So the first thing I did when I retired was I looked at a life expectancy calculator. Okay, I have 2 and 2.5 decades before my death. What am I going to do with myself? The next thing I looked at was called a disability calculator. And this is a result of 2 longitudinal studies that were done in England and the US with more than 17,000 participants who all were at least 50 years old. And what they did was they defined these unhealthy risk factors: inactivity, obesity, smoking, alcohol more than 5 days a week. And they define what they call disabilities, managing money, dressing, sort of activities of daily living. And based on the number of your age and the number of risk factors you have, you can calculate approximately how many years you have before you get a first disability, with 15 or 20 years before I have my first disability. That's a lot of time. Um, and so I immediately said, okay, I need to figure out how I'm going to do this retirement thing. So there are stages to retirement. This is not hard science. We're going to get into the hard science in a bit. Um, the first stage is basically an extended vacation, and people go into retirement. That's what they think they're going. Many people think that's what they're going to do for the rest of their life. They're just going to do whatever they want all the time, and it's just going to be like an extended vacation. The second stage of retirement is disenchantment. Many people start after 6 months or a year or two. Many people start to get bored with perpetual vacation. They find there's just not enough for them to do to keep them entertained intellectually, physically, and so forth. So that's when disenchantment happens, stage two. And in this disenchantment process, people start to grieve the loss of identity. People who are professionals in our world, their identity is, for many people, that's how they see their value in the world. I was a physician and I had a software company, and that was sort of how I reflected that, okay, I'm doing something valuable to the world. And that's true for a lot of professionals. And it took me a long time before I decided, okay, I don't need my medical license anymore. I'm done with that. And it's time to move on. And somebody mentioned how it's trying to figure out, it's a little bit daunting to decide when you're going to retire. One of the reasons is this loss of identity, purpose. People recognize, oh my God, this may happen to me. What do I do next? And we're going to talk about that. People, when they retire, start to lose friends, especially men. Um, and we're going to talk about that. And people who are in positions of power all of a sudden realize they have no more authority over the world than anybody else. Then we move into stage three. So for the people who are in stage two, some of them will say, okay, I need to make a change. And they start prototyping different things. They try volunteer activity. There's a book called Retiring, Creating a Life That Works for You. It talks about the whole retirement spectrum. I'm going to talk about basically from retiring on. This book starts earlier. How do you decide to retire? Um, and they talk about this identity bridging, which is one of the big reasons people who think they should retire hesitate, because they don't know what their new identity is going. In the back of their mind, they're like, "Oh my God, I'm not going to be a physician," but they haven't figured out what's they're going to do, and that without understanding that they need to create a new identity, a new purpose. That is a cause for hesitation. And we're going to talk about that. For those who succeed in finding a new purpose, they move it to stage four. And all of a sudden now they have a reason to get up every morning and something they want to do. So we start moving into the hard science. So the first study we're going to look at is the Harvard Study of Adult Development. This is a remarkable study. Probably all of you know, have heard of it. It started back in 1938 when Grant said to the white male Harvard sophomores, we're doing a study. We want to follow you for the rest of your life. We're going to do questionnaires, physical exam, lab tests periodically. So there were 268 people who they started to follow. At the same time, there was a second study going on out of Harvard Law School. Two professors were trying to answer the question that some Boston low-income teenagers who have no legal history compared to their peers, and they didn't understand why do some kids not get into trouble where other kids did. So they recruited 456 white, low-income Boston teenagers who had no legal history and decided to follow them. Ultimately, these two cohorts got merged. So you had this elite cohort from Harvard, and you had this underprivileged cohort from Boston, and the study has gone on till to this day. Sometime down the road, they've added women to the study. The spouses got added to the study, and then the next generation has got added. Three things popped out that were totally unexpected. The first was meaningful social relationships. Um, Turns out that was the most important determinant of whether a person was happy, the quantity and quality of meaningful social relations. And it turned out, unexpectedly, it correlated with better health and increased longevity. Now, one of the things that I always really find fascinating is when I see sort of a social science thing have a hard outcome that's clearly quantitative. And to me, having more friends was correlating with increased longevity was really quite an eye opener. The other things they found was having a sense of meaning and purpose in life and physical activity and physical fitness. In a talk that Dr. Wallinger, who was the current head of the study, gave a TED talk in 2016, um, he said the people in our 70 at that time 75-year-old study who were the happiest in retirement were the people who had actively worked to replace workmates with playmates. So remember that because we're going to come back to that. Now, since then, there have been lots of other studies that looked at meaningful social relations and its impact on happiness. This study, which comes out of the University of Chicago long-term survey, they found happiness correlated with social activities, which is sort of like meaningful social relations, religious and community activities, which I sort of throw in with social relations, reading a newspaper, and correlated negatively with watching television. In that study, what they found was they basically divided the people into three groups: very happy, average, and not very happy. And when you compare the very happy group to the not very happy group in terms of the number of visits between relatives, the people who were very happy had 11 more visits per year, um, sexual relations 10 more times per year, um, and all these others. And all of these were statistically significant. So this was a very, very large study. It was a systematic review and a meta-analysis. Most of the studies I'm going to show you are review studies and or meta-analysis because that's where you get the best data. We'll see some individual studies just for anecdotes. This was based on 148 clinical studies, um, 308,000 participants. And what they did was they basically looked at meaningful social relations and compared people who had high quality, meaningful social relations in terms of quality and quantity versus low quantity. And they found that there was a significant impact on longevity. And for overall, if you just look at the high people who have above average and below average meaningful social relations, um, the impact on longevity was about the same as smoking. So if you look at people who have meaningful social relations versus those who don't, and you follow the group and you wait until 50% of the group who has low social interactions dies, and the group with high social interactions, only 45% will have died. So there are lots of other benefits that come from meaningful social relations: lower depression, a greater sense of purpose, higher quality of what are considered desirable psychological traits, improved memory, better cardiometabolic health, better reduced risk of heart disease, and as we've already seen, increased longevity. So the reverse of meaningful social relations is loneliness. So the first thing we're going to look at is this time motion study. The x-axis is age. On the y-axis is hours per day spent either alone or with a partner or with your coworkers. And not surprisingly, as you can see in the burgundy line here, when people start to retire, the number of interactions with coworkers drops off. And as get older and their kids move out, the time they spend alone goes up. And then when they retire, interaction with the partner goes up. So I thought that this was just an interesting display of what we do. Um, on the right side is data on loneliness. And so the higher you're up on the x-axis, more lonely. So we got age. The gray shadowing is the average of all the data. And people are typically least lonely middle age and more lonely at the beginning of life and the end of life. Now, it turns out this is really important because loneliness in and of itself has a slew of health problems that happen as a result of loneliness, to the point where in Great Britain, they actually now have a minister of loneliness trying to deal with this problem because it has real health implications. You can be alone and not be lonely. And there's another study I'm going to mention later on, which found a subgroup of people who spend a lot of time alone but don't feel subjectively lonely. Now, in the Harvard study of adult development, um, when they asked the people who retired why they went back to work, the most common half of the population says they retired because they miss the people at work. And it turns out about 20% of people who retire go back to work. Male to male friendships are what are called side by side friendships. They typically arise in a setting where you're next to a person or interacting with a person on a regular basis, such as work. And they're usually activity based friendships. Um, and these friendships generally don't involve a lot of significant emotional content. They're very relatively superficial, as opposed to women friendships, which are face to face friendships. Um, they're typically created outside of employment, and there's more emotional content that's exchanged between the two women. And as a result, these are more valuable friendships and they're more durable. So when men retire, um, they tend to lose most of their friends. That's not a problem for women who work because most of their friends weren't really from the work environment to begin with, and their relationships uh, were uh, were more durable. Um, and there's some data to support this. There was one study called The Value of Friendships as We Age, which found that men over 50 were more likely than women to report having no close friends. Now, the problem with this is what happens is when the uh, man retires from work, he then piggybacks his social relationships onto his wife's because he has no social relationships. And that creates problems for his wife, where the traditional situation where the woman is stay at home and the man is working. And when the man retires, the happiness of the woman goes down. They did the reverse study where they looked at an 85-year-old man who was retired and his wife was working. And when his wife retired, his happiness goes up. So the retirement really has real implications for the social interactions of couples. So Kurt Vonnegut, who many of you will know who he is, had this made this statement at a commencement address in '78. I'll just paraphrase it. We were meant to live in extended families. Do what you can to get yourself extended families, no matter how arbitrary they may be. They do not have to be high grade people either. They can be imbeciles. What matters is numbers. Quality matters. The data is pretty clear on that, but the sentiment is there. There are ways you can quantify and qualify your meaning for social relations. The book highlighted at the bottom, the second to last line, The Good Life, Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study of Happiness, has surveys you can take so you can sort of figure out where you fall on the scale in terms of meeting social relations. Yesterday, I was reading a couple of articles, and they were trying to qualify how many close friends people need to basically feel satisfied. And the answer is not a lot, but somewhere between two and four, depending upon what parameter they were looking at. But many men have no close relations. So I started out by saying our goal is to have a happy, healthy, and fulfilling retirement. Meaningful social relations correlates with has benefits in terms of happiness, cognitive function, ability to think, mental health, psychiatric, psychological function, physical health, longevity, and it engenders a sense of fulfillment. So this is going to be the first objective on our strategic retirement plan. So what have I done to try to advance my number of meaningful social relations? Because when I retired, I basically had very few friends, male friends. The ones that I had were basically interactions from work. So the first thing I did, I went to the senior center, Somerville Council on Aging, and I attended their weekly senior walks and their monthly men's group. And it turned out that really didn't work for me for various reasons. So I abandoned it. Then I decided, okay, I need to create the environment where I'm going to develop friends. And I didn't really know how to do it, But the first one of the things I did early on was I created what I call a monthly REM brunch group, retired elderly men, and I basically talked to all the male people I knew in the Davis Square area and said, "I'm setting up this monthly brunch. We're going to meet at a cafe in Davis Square. Are you interested?" And over time, um, I got enough people, and there's attrition. People move away. They have other interests, and so I'm working to get people into the group. But at this point, I have a stable core that's probably maybe four or five. Um, and what we do is once a month we meet. We meet every Wednesday from 10 to 11. I will send an email to them the week ahead of time, just reminding them, and I asked them to respond as whether they're coming or not. If we don't have a quorum, which used to be three, three or four is what I've used. If we don't have a quorum, we don't meet. And at times there isn't a quorum. Two of the guys had houses up in Maine, so they take off for 3 months in the summer, and things come up. But I would say we met at least 8 months out of the year. And what has happened is these relationships have developed into meaningful social relations. Since then, I've gone to theater productions with people in the group with their spouses. We've gone to dinner at their house, at our house, in restaurants. So it that is actually working. Um, and then what I did is I expanded it. I decided through the MIT Club of Boston, I was going to create a re-brunch group, which stands for Retirees Brunch. And I ran it through the MIT Club of Boston. And because I was doing it that, I was uncomfortable saying men only. So I opened it up for anybody. And initially, for the first 3 months, I was the only male there, and there were 6 or 7 women involved. And when at one of the meetings, when one of the women referred to it as my harem, I decided, whoa, we need to get some men in this group. And now I've gotten in it. And that group filled up. And when it filled up, people were emailing me saying, I'd like to get into a group, and I didn't have one. So I created a second group, uh, Rebrunch 2, which is MIT alumni. So I had these retirement groups to meet the first week of the month, first Wednesday of the month, the second Wednesday of the month, and the third Wednesday of the month for an hour. And it does require a fair amount of coordination to keep people in the not keep people in the group, but keep the group number right. Because at every meeting, you have to have at least 4 people to have a group, and you can't have more than 8 because otherwise it's too big a group to have a single conversation in a noisy cafe. So I'm constantly sort of adjusting. Do I need another person? Not. It requires some effort. If anybody is interested in doing this, on my blog, there's an article basically say how to create a retirement group. What have I learned from doing this? And it's on my blog. Um, I also created a cycling group through the MIT Club of Boston. It was supposed to be every Thursday. Unfortunately, and so that started just this year. The first event, it was drizzly and cold, and I went and no one showed up because they were rational and I wasn't. Then it was too cold. It was in the 40s for I don't know 4 or 5 weeks. Then one person showed up, and then a different person. Then the next week, a 30-year-old woman showed up, and she was horrified because I was the only one there, and she was not looking to interact with somebody of my demographic. And then the week after that, 11 people showed up. So it's like, whoa, this is working. I also attend a lot of the MIT social events with my wife and I. My wife and I set up what we call a shoot the shit salon in our backyard. So we did this about 2 years ago. Send out an email to local neighbors. We're going to have a shoot the shit the salon 5:30 to 7 in our backyards. We'll supply stuff like this: fruit, nuts, vegetables to munch on. You're welcome to bring whatever indulgence you want. Um, and Usually we'll have somewhere between 2 and 6 people show up. And we just talk about anything. And sometimes people are just talking about their kids. Sometimes it's a meaningful conversation, but it's created a sense of community in our 2 block area around in Davis Square. And so, now when we interact, when we run into these people on the street all the time, there's always a conversation. It's not like you're walking past a stranger anymore. I set up a pickleball league through the MIT Club of Boston. That was not this past winter, but the winter before. And it turned out that didn't work in creating meaningful social relations because of the way I structured it. So I didn't do it again. I also run a semi-annual neighborhood potluck dinner. Again, trying to create a sense of community. And we really do have a sense of community in part of Davis Square. There's a great experiment called mistakenly seeking solitude. In the study, what they did was they told people when they get on the train, what the control group, they were going to be interviewed at the end of the train ride, and they're just going to ask them some questions. In the treatment group, they were told to try to strike up a conversation with a person you're sitting next to, even though you don't know them. They interviewed the people at the end, and all the people who were told to strike up a conversation said that was fantastic. It made the trip so much better. That's going to be my default going forward. And I've taken to doing that, and it definitely works. It definitely makes life more interesting. Sometimes people are not interested in talking, but those, 50% of the time when they do, all of a sudden you learn something about somebody. It just makes life better. So make it a point of talking to strangers. David Brooks has a book called How to Know a Person about how to engage in meaningful conversations. I listened to the book as an audiobook. I read the book. I outlined the book. The outline was too long, so I shortened my outline and I kept reading it over my outline over and over. I couldn't get myself to change how I interacted with people. I just couldn't get my brain to work differently. But for people who are more disciplined than I, that book is sort of a step-by-step guide of how do you interact with people to have meaningful conversations. One of the things that is important for seniors is intergenerational interactions. And in many of these things, the Shoot the Shit Salon, in our backyard, the Somerville Neighborhood Dinner, the age range is from 35 to 80. So there, at least three generations. Meaning intergenerational interactions has a small but measurable benefit on cognitive functions, psychological health, physical outcomes for the seniors. Now, as I told you before, some of the things I tried didn't work. Um, and so you have to anticipate some of the things on your tactical plan are going to fail, like my interaction, my attempt to go to the senior walks, my attempt to go to the men's group through the Somerville Council on Aging. And then, so I basically always fall back on Leonardo da Vinci's the last one. If the above effect is not obtained, waste no more time on it, just move on. And that's what I do. I drop out the stuff that's not working on my tactical plan, which is supposed to advance the objective of my strategic retirement plan. So from meaning for social relations, we're going to move on to meaning and purpose in life. Just to define it, this is an argument that's been going on in forever about what is the definition of meaning and purpose. To shorten it all, what I've come to believe is that I use the definition that the individual believes they have a life that has met their expectations. That's the meaning part, and gives them a reason to look forward to tomorrow. That's the purpose part. In most of these definitions, there's nothing about having to be a saint. Some of the definitions do include something like that, a commitment to strive to better other people, sacrifice of doing good for others. But after looking at all of it, I'm not convinced that that is essential. I suspect famous criminals think they have a meaning and purpose of life that is valuable to them. How do I get more money? And that's their priority, and that works for them. Um, so meaning and purpose, that's the definition we're going to go through. Now, this study, which included almost 7,000 people, at the beginning, this is called the Kaplan-Meier curve. So for the Kaplan-Meier curve, you take a parameter and you just follow the population as a function of time and just seeing who is still alive, or has your endpoint been met. So in this case, the endpoint is death. At the beginning of the study, which was appropriately controlled for things that should have been controlled for, like smoking, physical activity, psychological issues, physical health issues, and so forth, people took a questionnaire which measured their purpose, their life purpose. And the orange line at the top is the group with the highest scored life purpose. Okay. And if you just follow that group, that orange line, consistently, a higher percent of that group stays alive for the entire 6 years of the study compared to the other groups. Again, this is really remarkable to me. Having a purpose in life makes you live longer when you control for all the variables that they thought should have been controlled for. Now, there are the problems with these correlation studies is there are other variables that they didn't control for, that they didn't know they should control for, that could be impacting this. So this doesn't prove causality, it's just a correlation, but it's a pretty remarkable one because we see it divide nicely. And the way they defined, just so you know, for this particular study, how they defined purpose was people were given a questionnaire and they had to ask things, answer questions like, some people wander aimlessly through life, but I am not one of them. I live life one day at a time and I don't really think about the future. I sometimes feel as if I've done all there is to do in life, and other questions. And that's how they sort of define purpose. The second thing on our strategic plan, we're going to add a sense of purpose and meaning, because there's data that it increases happiness, uh, mental health, heart health, longevity, and gives a sense of fulfillment. So how did I basically define my sense of purpose? Um, when I retired, um, I started keeping an online diary. And then and I'm going to come back to that later. And as I read through the diary over time, patterns become apparent to me of what I think is interesting. For me, my sense of purpose right now is, how do I make this a better world in these domains? Building a community, meaningful social. How do I get more friends? Defending democracy, which is, been going on since 2016, and create stuff that I think is aesthetically, or emotionally, or intellectually resonant with the observer. That somehow it causes the person to think a thought or an emotion that they wouldn't have thought if they hadn't seen whatever I've done. So I do this in a couple of ways. Um, I do my political activism, and also I have an online blog. So I write articles about anything, healthcare, politics, what I did, uh, and sometimes I'll get emails from people who've read the article, and I know that it has stimulated a thought that they hadn't had. Or the banners up, people will come up to me and thank me for doing that. I know that has touched them in some way. I build stuff. So if you're ever on the Somerville Community Path, there are these two large sculptures. There's this elephant, which you can see down there. Um, I built that elephant, and it's an interactive sculpture. You lift up the trunk, and the ears flop forward. I can sit there across the path and watch the little kids or the adults do it, and their face lights up. I have these sculptures that I built also on the Somerville Community Path within vision of that one, two giraffes that are 19 feet tall. There's a wire that comes down the spine of the giraffe. If you pull the wire, the ears flip up. The little kids love it, to the point where my wife was there and there were 5 or 10 little kids with two teachers who apparently took the kids there twice a day for entertainment. And the giraffes have colored, they're painted yellow, but they have big spots on them: red, yellow, green, blue, orange, and so forth. And what the teachers will do is find the green spot, and they all run around looking for a green spot and that sort of thing. So my wife comes over to the teachers and said, do you know that there's a wire that comes down the spine, and if you pull the wire, the kids can make the ears go up? And the teacher said, yeah, we know, but they're only allowed to do it 5 times, so everybody gets a turn. Um, Stuff like this. When I go over and introduce myself, people thank me for it. It never occurred to me, but it has given me a sense of joy that I've had an impact. And that's a picture from the article in the Globe about a year ago that they wrote about it, because I put it up without asking permission. But now I know they can't take it down, because if they did, the community is going to have a fit. I also make sculptures, I'm sorry, frames and furniture. And this frame is sort of a typical example. Is, it's, yes, it's just a frame. But what happened with this frame, if people come up, one of the couple would rotate the frame so the bottom of the frame was parallel to the ground. And the other one said, no, no, that's not right. The picture has to be parallel to the, and to see that interaction makes me feel like, okay, it's done something. And then I give this lecture series, which I find very rewarding. So what can you do to get a sense of purpose? Well, do volunteer work. We're going to talk about that in a second. Join a club. I kept a gratitude journal and an online diary, which I found helpful. You can Google how to find a purpose in life. There is a lot of stuff out there on that. Um, you can have a conversation with ChatGPT, and if you're not using it, open up ChatGPT. There's a way you can click a button and have a conversation and say, I'm such and such an age. These are my interests. I'm trying to figure out, should I retire? How do I find a sense of purpose in life? And it will walk you through this. It's mind boggling what it'll do. Um, There's a great book called Designing Your Life. For those who are appropriate age may recall there was a book, What Color is Your Parachute? It's sort of like this. This one comes from a course at Stanford, which is the most popular course in Stanford by two mechanical engineers, basically teaching people how to prototype their life through essays and experiences. And my wife did this, and what she ended up, so she was a mechanical engineer at MIT, got a master's at Berkeley, ultimately, started out as a real engineer and moved up the hierarchy where she was managing engineers and managing research projects. And then at one point, she decided I had enough of this. And she basically read through the book, prompted by the book. She went to a lecture that was really designed for women who basically were full-time moms who are now just entering empty nest time. And how do they move forward? And one of the women who was giving the lecture explained that, oh, became a docent, and then she went and got an advanced degree at Harvard on museum studies, and a light bulb went off my wife, and basically did that. And now she has a job where she works 2 days a week from home, um, in consulting on how to design museums and exhibits with her boss, who's just, so it's two of them in the company. And that all came from Designing Your Retirement book. Lastly, I would say just change your mindset. Just say yes to every opportunity. I was of the type of people said, why don't you go do this with me? It's like, that's not my shtick. And I'd pass. Now I just try to force myself to say yes because it opens up doors that you wouldn't walk through before. So just say yes. So we're going to move on from meaning and purpose to physical activity because this is the third thing the Harvard study um, uh, found correlated with happiness. Now, but I want to. This is a sort of a warning about all these correlational studies. This was a very big study, 23 studies put together, systematic review, and what I want to call your attention to is the wording. These are quotes from the study. All observational studies reported a positive association between physical activity and happiness. Six randomized control trials suggested that exercise was effective in improving happiness, and as little as 10 minutes of physical activity a week, blah, 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 might increase the level of happiness. The authors understood that although they had a lot of suggestive data, they basically said we cannot draw firm conclusions regarding the causal relationship between physical activity and happiness. So, what I'm all about to tell you is take it with a grain of salt, but there is so much data in my mind. Physical activity does increase people's happiness. So this is a very large study, the NHANES study. This is a study done by CDC, the National Health and Nutrition and Examination Survey. It's been going on for quite a while. 120,000 people, 34 years. In this study, they define what they call low risk factors. So we're used to thinking of high risk factors like smoking. This is the opposite side. So low risk factors are things that are healthy: exercising regularly, never smoking, not overweight, not drinking too much, and having a high quality diet. And so this basically compares the group who is very healthy, who's doing all the right things, to somebody who's the group that's very unhealthy, who's doing all the wrong things. If you're a 65-year-old woman compared to somebody who's doing all the wrong things, if you're doing all the right things, your life expectancy will be 12 years longer. I mean, these are real numbers. Now, the data in the study, they drill down a lot further. And you can, the reason I'm showing you this is if you get the PDF, you can basically look at yourself on these curves at your age and your gender. The top one is the life expectancy at age 50 based on the risk factors. So if you're a female and you have zero healthy lifestyle factors. You're basically doing horribly. You don't exercise, you smoke, you're overweight, you drink too much, and you have a high quality diet. At age 50, you can expect to live 29 years. Conversely, and you're doing all the right thing, you can expect to live 43 years. And the same data for men. But down here is the data where you can look at it at your age. So for females, if you, this red line, adopt just one healthy lifestyle factor and you're 55 years old, you would live about 2.5 years longer than somebody who has no healthy lifestyle factors. So I show this to you not for you to sit down and and tease it apart now, but it's something you may want to come back to later. Also, in this same study, they proved that the duration of exercise correlated with increased longevity. This a woman who's exercising a half hour to 2 hours a week. Um, the gain in longevity at 65 compared to somebody who's not exercising is about 4 years. But if the person's exercising 5.5 hours a week or more, the gain in longevity compared to unhealthy lifestyle is 7 years. So you can actually go through this and tease it out. But the important point is the amount of exercise impacts your longevity. There's also data that the intensity of the exercise impacts your longevity. They break exercise into mild, moderate, and strenuous. And in each of those, you burn up a certain amount of calories per week. And that can be done by exercising intensely for a shorter period of time or very mildly for a longer period of time. But it's a total number of calories you're burning up in your exercise. So duration matters, and also intensity matters. Another way to look at the data from a different study was the probability that a 70-year-old man would get to age 90 based on these risk factors. If somebody smokes, has diabetes, is poorly controlled, is overweight, has high blood pressure that's not controlled, and is sedentary, the probability of a 70-year-old man getting to 90 is only 4%. If the man is exercising, doesn't smoke, doesn't have diabetes, um, blood pressure controlled, and so forth, the probability of a 70-year-old man getting to age 90 is 54%. And there's data like this on women, which is in the handout. Physical activity and neuroplasticity. So when I went to medical school, I was taught that the nerves in the brain are fixed. What you got when you're born is all that you're going to get. And if you go out and binge alcohol, you're killing off brain cells and it's all downhill. Well, it turns out that was wrong. The brain is like all the other organs. You know, your muscles get bigger when you exercise, your bones get stronger when you exercise. The brain remodels itself in response to exercise, learning, and experiences. You grow new nerve cells, there are new connections, synapses, the blood supply increases. And this was a large review of 160 studies. In response to these various parameters, they found increases in the volume of the brain, which would imply there were actually more nerve cells, more nerves. There were changes in what are called neurotropic factors. These are chemicals made that stimulate brain growth, stimulate the production of connections between the brain and increase brain flow. And from a clinical perspective, when people exercise regularly, all these bad things, likelihood of them being a problem, decrease, anxiety, depression, and these desirable things increase in response to exercise. Now, the problem with this study was, although it was 160, it looked at 160 articles, many of the conclusions the author drew was based on one or two studies. And some of these small studies, there's like a dozen or 2 dozen people in the study. So I would take a lot of it with a grain of salt, but there's a lot of data. And the author concluded, robust literature demonstrates that chronic aerobic exercise is associated with potent structural and functional neuroplastic, meaning nerve changes, with an improvement in cognitive function or thinking. And I really believe this. So I'm going to talk about being out in nature, and we're going to circle back down in a bit back to physical activity. You'll see why. So this was a study, again, large study, 143 studies looking at 100 health outcomes. And what they found was exposure to nature had measurable health benefits. Blood pressure was better, heart rate was better, salivary cortisol, which is a stress hormone, levels were lower, with decreased risk of diabetes, all-cause mortality, and cardiovascular health. And the conclusion of this big meta-analysis systemic review is the preponderance of the evidence has shown that exposure to the great outdoors has mental health and physical health benefits. So we know that exercise is beneficial. We just saw that being outdoors is beneficial. Does it matter if I exercise in the gym or I exercise outdoors? Does it matter if I exercise in the gym and outdoors in the middle of Harvard Square, or outdoors in green space in the middle of Cambridge Common. And what they did in the second study was they basically tried to compare the benefits of exercising in outdoors in green space versus an urban environment. And a typical study that they looked at would be there was one done at Stanford, and they sent people to go for a walk. And in one case, they walked down whatever that main street is near Stanford, and they walked for 2 hour. I don't know how long they walked, but they walked and came back. And then they did studies. They did brain scans on them. They did psychological tests and blood tests. The other group went for a walk in the plantations, an area of oak trees and greenery. And from that, they concluded that even though these two people spent the same amount of calories in exercising, there were clearly benefits to the exercise amongst green space. So what I would tell you is the data on physical activity is being inactive is bad, duh. Exercising indoors is good, duh. Um, Exercising in an urban setting outdoors is better than exercising indoors, but the best thing is to exercise in green space. So what I do, and we're going to come back to it later, is I actually cycle 3 times a week down the Minuteman Bike Trail from here, Davis Square, to Alewife, out the Minuteman Bike Trail to Bedford and back, and it's a 2 hour ride. I don't ride fast. Anybody who is 40 or less is passing me. I mean, fortunately, no runners pass me, but I'm getting exercise. Um, and what I found was that I come back feeling so much better. And I am absolutely convinced that a lot of it is the Minuteman Bike Trail is beautiful. It's got this tree canopy that covers you the whole way. It changes seasonally. It's gorgeous. And I'm sure that whatever biology gets changed in my body, I definitely feel better. Sleep also has a major impact on our health. Somewhere between 6 and 10 hours is the optimum amount of sleep. More sleep or less has health problems, increased disease rate, and increased mortality. So somewhere between 6 and 10 hours. Guidelines usually recommend somewhere between 7 and 9 hours for adults. The study on the right was a very interesting study that came out of Ecuador, and they looked at the quality of sleep. And what they did is they did the survey at the beginning. Again, this is a Kaplan-Meier curve, percent survival, 0 to 100%, years of follow-up, and they just looked at who was alive. And when they compared the group who had the good quality sleep to the poor quality sleep, the people who had the good quality sleep definitely lived longer than the other group. Now, the study is problematic because COVID happened in the middle of this, and God knows how that affected it. Whether good and poor quality sleep in Ecuador has the same ramifications in an urban setting like us, I don't know. But it's a tantalizing piece of data that both duration and quality of sleep matter. Now, I'm going to talk very briefly about dementia. And the reason I'm going to talk about it is that everybody seems to believe exercise reduces the risk of dementia. And so that's why I threw it in this section. Mild cognitive impairment is your thinking is not quite as good as they think it should be. And it's based on a questionnaire the doctors ask you. Here are 5 objects. I'm going to ask you about them in a little bit. Draw a clock face that says such and such a time, and several others. The percent of people with mild cognitive impairment is basically constant. And the percent with dementia is relatively low. And as people get older, it goes up. It turns out there are many different types of dementia, from Alzheimer's dementia, dementia that occurs as a result of the plugging up of the arteries to the brain, just like in heart disease. And we lump all these together in the studies, and that's really problematic because the underlying cause is very different. The bottom line is there is no study which has demonstrated that exercise reduces the risk of dementia nor slows the rate of progression of dementia. When I was a physician, I would tell people who had mild cognitive impairment, which is one of the before, this is pre-dementia, and some of those people will go on to get dementia, but not all of them, or not, that they should exercise. And even though the data isn't there, and the reason I did that is I have to look, I have to make a decision, even in an imperfect world when I don't have the right answer or all the answers. Um, and so when that happens, I look at the risk and benefit. Well, the risk of telling somebody to exercise is basically zero. It's not zero, but it's really, really pretty low. So I would tell those people to exercise. Now, this was a big study, came out of the UK, 78,000 people. And what they were looking at is exercise and the risk of dementia. And it had the appropriate confounding variables adjusted for it: age, sex, race, smoking, alcohol, and so forth. So the baseline was, I think it was 2,000 steps. If a person does 3,800 steps per day, the risk of dementia drops about 25% compared to the person who only does 2,000 steps a day. If a person does 9,800 steps a day, the risk of dementia compared to somebody who's doing 2,000 or less, the risk drops by 50%. It doesn't drop it to zero, but it has a big impact. And now somebody's going to say, because this group will pick it out, why does the curve go up in the second half? The answer to that is the authors think it's a statistical fluke because the number of people in that group, that segment who did 20,000 steps a day or more was so small. Any exercise appears to have an impact on dementia. There's a bi-directional impact between exercise and cognitive function, or exercise and dementia. When people get dementia, they stop exercising because of the dementia, and it's hard to tease out which came first. So you don't. So it's a problematic area. The second thing is, even just coming up with a diagnosis of dementia is problematic because it's a clinical diagnosis. It's not like you're measuring the speed of a photon. Any exercise is good. I would say make sure you get at least 4,000 steps a day, preferably closer to 10. Australia, there's a big study where they looked at people who are cognitively normal, and they followed 10,000 people. They were 98% were white for 10 years. And at the beginning, they did some assessment. And what they found was people who engaged in certain critical thinking, logical reasoning, or social interactions could reduce their risk of dementia by 7 to 11%. And these would include, journaling, working on a computer, playing certain types of games, um, passive activities, reading, even watching TV, listening to music, and artwork. So, my take on it is the data is what it is. 7 to 10, 11% is not a big number, but this is what the data is. A study that just came out in 2024, an assessment on all these things on the left-hand side, and basically compared them to people who don't have the problem. So, for example, if you have untreated hearing loss, your risk of dementia is 40% higher than somebody who has hearing loss but is wearing a hearing aid. All right, so if you correct the hearing loss, you can reduce your risk of dementia 40%. So anybody who's got hearing loss and doesn't want to wear a hearing aid for whatever reason, they're putting their cognitive function at risk. The data on the right is if you eliminated the problem on the left, what would the total population risk of dementia, the total number of population, how would it be affected? So if everybody who had hearing loss got a hearing aid, it would drop the total population who have dementia by 7%. If you add up all of these things and you do all the treatable stuff, so some of it is not treatable. People who had traumatic brain injury, you can't fix that. That happened. People who are significantly less educated, that's already happened. If you fix all the stuff you can fix, you get rid of all the obesity, too much alcohol, all of these things, everybody gets glasses, you would reduce the risk of the total population who has dementia by 45%, not 100%. And that's probably because there are different types of dementia, and and some of these things will not respond to that. So the data on dementia is, as of last year, there's no cure to stop or reverse dementia once you have it. There are modifiable risk factors, which we went through: depression, poorly controlled diabetes, hearing loss, vision loss, cholesterol, blood pressure problems, obesity, physical inactivity, too much alcohol, um, and engage in cognitive activities. All of those things should be taken care of. All right, so let's go back to physical activity. The current guidelines: 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity every week. It doesn't matter how you break it up. 75 minutes twice a week, 11 minutes twice a day. It's the total number of minutes per week. To decide what type of activity you're doing, whether it's classified as low, moderate, or vigorous, the data is on the right. And it turns out for each of these activities, 75 minutes a week of vigorous exercise, 150 or 300 minutes, all burns the same number of minutes. So when I do my cycling, the 6 hours 3 times a week takes me a lot longer. If I was to do intense exercise for a much shorter period of time, I wouldn't have to spend so much time. But the exercise riding on the Minute Bike Trail has lots of other benefits for me. If anybody wants data on longevity, there's an article I wrote that's on my blog. longevity in 25 graphs. And there's a lot of data showing how multiple different things affect longevity. Engage in physical activity, preferably in nature because it has these benefits. This is how I do my exercise. I cycle 3 times a week. And when I cycle, what I do to make it more fun for me is I listen to music or an audiobook. And if I want to ride fast, I listen to Tina Turner. If I don't want to ride fast, I'll listen to something else. And there are links to articles for people who are about exercise. If you're concerned about it, whether you should do it, what you should do. Next thing we're going to talk about is volunteering. There is a lot of data about the benefits of volunteering, far more than I ever anticipated. But on the top right, volunteering has benefits in terms of longevity and physical function, which is the most important. But there are a whole lot more. What I wanted to tell you here was I really like it, as I said before, when the hard sciences tie in with the social sciences. So um, as we age, uh, methyl group CH3 attach to our DNA. And by quantifying how much CH3 is attached to our DNA, we get what's called our epigenetic age, which may be different than our chronologic age. It's basically a way of how is our DNA aging. The first study I wanted to talk about included 2,605 people. And what they did was they basically calculated the epigenetic age um, for people who were doing volunteer work, comparing it to people who didn't do volunteer work. What they found was the epigenetic age was much younger. They had greater cognitive function, physical function, compared to people whose epigenetic age was much older. Then there was a study of 299 studies looking at this. And the reason there's so many studies was there are lots of techniques for figuring out how much of the DNA is methylated. And they concluded that epigenetic age was particularly effective at predicting cardiovascular health and mortality. And they also found that people who had smoked and drank too much alcohol had a higher epigenetic age. So here are two things that appear to actually adversely impact the age of your DNA. It's very clear that people who volunteer have a lower epigenetic age. So I just told you volunteering has a lot of benefits. However, the volunteering has to be done altruistically. People who volunteer and are doing it for non-altruistic reasons, like the spouse says you need to go work in the soup kitchen, those people don't get the health benefits from people who are volunteering altruistically. And a hand-waving explanation would be to look back at this epigenetic age. We know when people volunteer altruistically, hormones change in a favorable direction. Inflammation markers go down, stress levels go, hormones go down. And it's not unreasonable to hypothesize that some of these changes are affecting our epigenetic age. So people who volunteer involuntarily, they're basically counting the minutes to get out, and it's just another stress of life. Whereas the people who volunteer because they want to be there feel like they're doing something good. And even though both groups have done something good, only the one who really wants to be there is going to get the benefit. Altruistic volunteering has been correlated with happiness, mental, physical benefits, longevity, social connections, and purposefulness. I found my volunteering life is I correlated it with my purpose in life. And I've already told you my purpose in life at this point is build community, defend democracy, and create things that emotionally or intellectually resonate with others. This is the volunteer, what I consider my volunteer work, like a lecture like this, like the defending the democracy, like the other stuff that I talked about in terms of building community. For people who are looking to do volunteer work but don't know where to go, volunteermatch.org, you put in your zip code and it'll tell you what groups are looking for help. And what I would say is, again, just say yes to every opportunity that comes your way, um, even when it's outside your comfort zone. So next we're going to talk about income and money. Um, the social science community believes money doesn't buy happiness. And that came from this first study, 2010. Daniel Kahneman and Agnes Deaton, both Nobel laureates at Princeton. I believe they were both social scientists, not economists. They did a study that was published in PNAS, so And what they found was if you look at income from zero to $75,000 a year back in 2010, people's happiness went up. But once they got to 75,000, if their income went higher, they didn't get happier. It plateaued. To this day, that's what the social science will still tell you. Money doesn't buy happiness. In 2021, Matthew Killingsworth, who's also at Princeton, looked at the data in a different way. And what he found was there was no evidence for a plateau at $75,000 a year. So, in a remarkable confluence of how academia is supposed to work, Daniel Kahneman and Killingsworth get together with a third academic and they pool their data to try to figure out why they had different. I love that sentence because it's like typical academia. We engage in an adversarial collaboration to search for a coherent interpretation of both studies. And so they put all the data together. And what they did was they analyzed it a bit differently. So on this axis is income. On this axis is happiness from a scale of 50 to 80. And so they have all these data points. And then they divide them into approximately into quintiles. $100,000 is this line down the middle. They basically curve fit the data in this section to a straight line. Same here, 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 here. And what they found was that for people who are in the least happy group, as their income rose up to $100,000 a year, they got happier. But once it went higher than that, this least happy group didn't get any happier. It was as if once their food, clothing, and shelter needs were met, nothing was going to make them happier. Whereas in the happiest group, and everybody else, higher income led to happiness. Now, the thing that's really remarkable is in the group that is the most happy, the slope of the line is the steepest for this group who's most happy. And the way I look at it is there's a center in your brain, and something happens, a signal comes in, and the output of this organ is going to be happiness, how happy you are. Some people, the gain is turned really high. So if somebody hands them a lollipop, they get really happy. Whereas most people get handed a lollipop, it doesn't have an impact. And I think that's how the brain works in terms of happiness. For 85% of the population, higher income generally results in more happiness. This doesn't look at incremental income. It basically looked at the income at the beginning of the study. So these were people at one moment in time. How do you spend your money to be happy? The data is you buy experiences, not objects. There's something in the psychology world called hedonic adaptation. People buy a new iPhone, a new car, whatever their toy is that they like, and they're really happy. 6 months later, it's just a car, it's just an iPhone. Buying experiences, not objects, increases the happiness. Shared experiences increases happiness over solo experiences. And it turns out these experiences, shared experiences, the happiness goes up with time. As I said, with hedonic adaptation, you buy a new car, and 6 months later, it's just a car. When you have a shared experience, 6 months later, you share the photos with the person you interacted with, or you reminisce about going to a play or something, and you relive the happiness. So there's a reinforcement. It's a long-term form of happiness. Other ways to increase your happiness long term: physically active, mentally challenging activities, social interactions. If you have extra money, use it to acquire free time, and then use that free time in a way that will make you happier through social interactions. And I would add to this: use your money on your strategic retirement plan to advance the objectives of your strategic retirement plan. So, fifth thing on our strategic retirement plan, we're going to add invest for long-term happiness because it brings happiness and a sense of fulfillment. That's what I do. I spend a lot of time and money and effort on social interaction, shared experiences, as you've seen before, and then I spend a fair amount of money basically trying to implement my strategic retirement plan. The drafts and the elephants cost me a lot of money to build, but I have no regrets about it. This designing a retirement lecture, it's a lot of investment of not so much time, but there is not so much money, but there's a lot of time that's been put into it. There's something called self-perception of aging, and this study came out of Yale in 2002, and this was the first study of its kind. Um, And my self-perception of aging is, do you think getting older is bad or good? How do you perceive older people? So in this study, there were 660 participants, 98% Caucasian, and did a questionnaire at the very beginning of the study and basically divided the group in half, those who had above average self-perception of aging score and below average. This is a Kaplan-Meier curve again, percent alive on the y-axis, years since the interview, and what they see in the study, and these again were controlled for the variables that they knew to control for. And what we find is people who view getting older adversely have a higher death rate. Few of them are alive as the years go by compared to people who have a positive self-perception of aging. Now, I don't know if there's anything we can do about this. I'm in a fortunate position that my image of getting older has to do with my recollections of my grandmother and my mother, who both had been very active. And so I had a very positive perception of what it was like to get older. When I was a practicing physician and I was about to retire, 40% of the patients told me, don't retire, you're going to be bored to death. And the other 60% said it's going to be great. You're going to have a great time. Um, this self-perception of aging is really very intriguing to me. So now we're going to move on a little bit to talk about happiness. And what I know about happiness is I learned from this class that I took online, Managing Happiness by Arthur Brooks. He's a professor at Harvard Business School who writes about happiness, and he writes for The Atlantic. And happiness has three components: enjoyment, satisfaction, and meaning. And enjoyment has three components: pleasure, appreciation, knowledge. Pleasure is happiness in the moment. For people who like to water ski, being dragged around the lake on skis, that's their happiness, that's their pleasure. Appreciation and knowledge is a more durable form of happiness. I like physics, and going to hear a lecture, my background of what I know makes that lecture more enjoyable. People who know music, when they go to a classical music performance, their knowledge and prior experiences will increase, and that's where they get their enjoyment. Satisfaction is what you have divided by what you want. So you can get happier by buying more stuff. Or there was a famous musician, Leonard Cohen, and at one point he gave up his music career and became a monk. He basically said, I don't want anything. He gave away everything he had, and his satisfaction went up. When I was a physician, what happened was I gave up being a physician. I changed what I wanted from being a physician to basically nothing, and my satisfaction went up. And the reason I'm telling you this is there are different ways you can make yourself happier. And the last one is, do you have a meaning in life? Now, it turns out from identical twin studies, half of our happiness is determined by our genetics. Remember, I talked to you about that gain in the brain. That's probably where it comes from, or something like that. You can't do anything about that. A quarter of our happiness is determined by our circumstances, and there may not be stuff you can readily deal with there. But our habits are definitely something that you can change. And we're going to, in a little while, I'll talk about habits and how you actually change them. So I'm going to skip through all this, except to tell you that our brain has a negativity bias. We devote more energy, brain resources to negative stuff than positive stuff. And the reason is from an evolutionary perspective. Pretend you're on the plains of Africa and you have a negativity bias and you're walking up a hill because you know there's a blueberry patch. Crouch down, you look carefully over, you want to make sure there's not a lion there or the other tribe. You're very, very cautious. Somebody who has a positivity bias would get to the crest of the hill and say, oh my God, I'm almost there, and run over into the mouth of the lion. The first one's going to pass on their genes more than the second one. So it turns out in our brain, we actually devote more energy, more volume for negative thoughts. There are two types of happiness: hedonic happiness, which is happiness in the moment, being towed around on a lake while you're water skiing or something like that, and eudaimonic happiness, which is happiness which is more long term. And the example there I would give is preparing a Thanksgiving dinner. For somebody, preparing a Thanksgiving dinner and sitting down with a family, that is the ultimate form of pleasure. So in this study, they looked at a group of genes called CTRA genes. And this is a group of genes that when they're very active, it's associated with adverse health effects. Um, Increased inflammation, leading to problems, heart problems, problems with the nervous system, increased risk of cancer, and a decreased ability to fight viral infections. So when the CTRA group of genes are ratcheted up, there are apparently going to be downstream adverse health consequences. And what they found in this study was people who scored very high. So everybody has both hedonic and eudaimonic happiness, and we have most of us have most hedonic with a little bit of eudaimonic. But there's some people who have a lot more hedonic, and some people who have less hedonic. When they broke the group up into people who scored very high on the hedonic happiness versus very high in the eudaimonic happiness, what they found is people who scored very high on the hedonic happiness, this group of genes, the CTRA, were much more active than in the other group. And I thought, well, this is really pretty fascinating. Different types of happiness, groups are equally happy, but based on the type of happiness they have, we're seeing differences in gene activity. So I don't know which came first, the gene activity that drives us to be hedonic or eudaimonic, but I thought it was intriguing. Oxytocin is a hormone made by in the brain, which has favorable effects um, on how you feel. And there are things you can do to bump up your oxytocin level. Staring into the eyes of your dog, petting your dog, doing volunteer work, and all these other things that are listed in the bottom. There was a famous psychologist, Martin Seligman, in 1998. He was president of the American Psychological Association. He's at Penn, and he decided rather than study people who have psychopathology, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and so forth, he was going to push to have people be studied who are ostensibly happy and have nothing wrong with them. And the idea was we will learn something from this group that will apply to everybody. And it turns out that that hypothesis turned out to be right. Uh, and he came up with something called the Hope Circuit, which they have hard science experiments in rats that basically showed that when a rat is in a situation that is adversely affecting the rat, say they're on a cage that has giving them a small shock to their feet and there's nothing they can do to get out, they basically give up and they just sit down and just accept the shock. And what they found was that if they stimulated a certain part of the cerebral cortex, so this part of the brain, the signal now is starting in the top of the brain and is going down to the middle of the brain. If they stimulate this part of the brain, the rat doesn't give up and it tries to rescue itself. And that's called the hope circuit. That conscious thoughts, can somehow affect how emotions impact us. And I've seen that giving up in patients who had depression. There are lots of patients I've seen over the years who had severe depression, and no matter what I would tell them to do, they weren't going to try anything. Their brain is basically said, it's hopeless. I can never solve this problem. They just give up. So out of this hope circuit understanding, several strategies to affect that gain on the happiness dial have emerged. And I'm not going to go to these because really are most of them are beyond my understanding, but there are things you can do. The one that I thought is most interesting is this last one, reward sensitivity training. By doing a series of experiments, you can basically get your brain to increase the gain on this happiness dial in your brain. Um, and what the studies have shown was that it reduces depression, anxiety, stress, and suicide ideation. You basically have retrained your brain to react to events in the world in a way that is more helpful to your emotional well-being. Um, and again, so that's really pretty remarkable. This curve on the left is a measure of happiness as a function of age. And if you look at the dotted blue line in America, people are happier when they're 18, they get less happy, 22, they get more happy, then they get less happy midlife crisis, and then they get happier for the rest of their life. Now, in America, we have certain confounding variables that we know affect happiness, and those are education, marriage, and employment. If you subtract out the effects of those three things, you get this U-shaped happiness curve. Happy very young, not so happy middle age, happy older. If you do this study anywhere in the world and you subtract out those local confounding variables, which will be different, you get the same U-shaped curve. If you do the study on animals in the zoo, you get a U-shaped happiness curve. Happy in the beginning, less happy, and more happy. It's as if somehow this is part of our biology. And to me, this was really intriguing. Now, the caveat is there was another study that came out recently, which looked at they looked at life satisfaction. So it's not quite happiness, but to me, maybe it's close. And what they found was in the data from 2005 to 2010, they got that U-shaped happiness curve that we saw over there. In the latest set of data, though, what they found was that young people under the age of 30, their happiness has dropped markedly. And they don't have any explanation as why. I mean, we can say the world is burning up, the political world is falling apart, COVID, these people, didn't have a normal high school, didn't have a normal college. I mean, we can speculate as to why that curve is like that. And maybe the curve will go back, or maybe it's a permanent change, or maybe this is a wave that's going to move out with time. So we're going to add hack your brain to augment happiness because it increases your happiness and mental health. And we didn't go into all the list of activities you can do, but it's all in the handout. So what do I do? My tactical plan to augment my brain for happiness. Um, Several of these things. I keep a gratitude journal. Um, I have two dogs, so I can get adequate dose of oxytocin into my body. And the others, not so much for me. The thing that's important is that in biological systems, one treatment doesn't work for everybody. So, I took care of lots of people who had high blood pressure. There are probably a dozen classes of blood pressure medicines, and within each class, there are multiple medicines. It was trial and error. And in some people, the first drug worked. In some people, I'd have to get to some combination with a third drug. The same is going to be true here. Some of these may work at first shot, but if they don't, you could try a second, a third, and if all else fails, then you have to meet with a therapist because they have a lot more skills and techniques in knowing how to use these and other things. Caveats, we already talked about ethnic groups, or at least I tried to make it clear, are underrepresented in most scientific studies, and that's a problem. And you guys all know correlation doesn't imply causality. This is the strategic retirement plan. This applies to everybody because it's evidence-based, as I tried to show you. Then what I did was I needed to add my personal objectives to this. And the way I figured out what are my personal objectives in life is I went to my online diary and I just sort of read through it and things popped out at me. What makes a good day? And the list that I kept was some form of meeting, social interaction, not surprising because we already know that causes happiness, exercising, not surprising, learning something new, an absence of stressful activities, and creating or making something or even repairing something. And I also seem to have an interest over and over again in understanding the secular spiritual world. I grew up in a very quantitative world, but there's a large part of the world that isn't what's the most important to them. I never understood that part of the world, but it's been around since the beginning of time, so it must have some value. I mean, just the history of it tells me it's got to have some real value. Otherwise, it would have died out. So the first thing on my that I'm going to add for me, this your list will be different. Engage in intellectual activities, and in Boston, there's a shitload of stuff to do. I mean, MIT Club of Boston by themselves offers, and MIT offers more stuff than you can ever possibly do. Um, People are interested in writing. There's Grub Street where they help teach writing. Harvard has an extension school. There are lots of learning and retirement programs. Cambridge Center for Adult Ed, online stuff. There's just lots of stuff you can do. And I've done a lot of these. I do blogging on that's one of the things I do for intellectual activities, read audiobooks. I'm sorry, listen to audiobooks, read regular books. If you're not playing with AI like ChatGPT, go out and do it because it is the future. This is something that's going to be with us and it's going to change the world. There's a great book, Kissinger, Craig Monday, and Eric Schmidt. So Eric Schmidt he was the CEO of Google. Monday was head of AI for Microsoft, and Henry Kissinger wrote a book about the impact of AI. After you read that book, it will convince you you need to start dabbling if you're not, because it's going to change the world in ways we don't even understand. Next thing that I added was avoid needlessly stressful activities. Um, I do not engage in political conversations with people who believe the earth is flat. There's just no point. Um, and I also basically try to avoid engagement with the healthcare system. It left some real scars, and I can't fix it. I have to move on. Like Vinci said, if the above is effect is not obtained, waste no more time on it. The next to last thing was engage in creative activities. And I've already alluded to the stuff. I make frames that I think are visually interesting that cause people to say, that's different. What's there? I made this chest of drawers. And the idea there was to create a chest of drawers that looked random. It turns out it's not really random. There's a symmetry. The top, if you rotate around the center, the top rotates around 180 degrees. Both my wife and I found that inertia was a real problem uh, in retirement, in the sense that it was very easy to just sit around and continue drinking a cup of coffee at the dining room table and bullshitting when she has scheduled herself to do painting. I scheduled myself to do stuff in my shop or whatever. Inertia sometimes is really hard to overcome. Now, the professionals, people like David Brooks, authors David Brooks, David Sedaris, and Lamont, will tell you what they do is they schedule times and they have to sit at their desk for that 4 hour window and they're not allowed to get up, even if they do nothing but stare at a blank piece of paper. And with that, when they do that, eventually the creativity arises. The way, and I tried that, but I wasn't disciplined enough. What my wife and I have both discovered independently was we change our goals. If my plan was to go into the basement and start working on this project, thinking it was going to take another 4 hours to do the next stage, and I don't want to do it, I'd say to myself, okay, just go clean up the basement. Tomorrow you'll do that. And I go down and clean up the basement, and almost inevitably, I end up doing the project after I clean it up. And she does the same thing. She has a painting studio in the backyard. She'll say, okay, I'll just clean the brushes today, clean up the studio. And inevitably she'll sit down. 3 hours later, she's still there. So that's how we've overcome our initial. We changed our expectations. Last thing on my list was explore the secular spiritual world. First, I tried meditation. If you're interested and haven't done it, John Kabat-Zinn has a class on masterclass. It's like a 21 session class. I tried it. It didn't really work for me. I think for me, cycling is my meditation. When I ride down the Minuteman bike trail under that green canopy and come home, I feel great. I was very interested in hallucinogenics. Um, there's a lot of data how hallucinogenics cause different parts of the brain to talk to each other. I really wanted to try that. Turns out in Silicon Valley in late 60s and early 70s, the software engineers were using a lot of hallucinogenics in very low doses because it found that it could help them solve problems that they couldn't solve otherwise. It just gave them ideas that they didn't have. And so I originally read Michael Pollan's book. It turns out he and I went to high school together. We were in the same health ed class when we were told that if we took any hallucinogenic, it would alter our DNA and our kids would be mutants. I tried low dose psilocybin. It didn't have much of an effect. As I recall, I was laying on the backyard on the grass watching the ants for a couple of hours, but it didn't have much of an effect beyond that. I tried it at a slightly higher dose and then I got nauseous and that was rather unpleasant. So I haven't gone back to it. But I've had multiple friends who've done these guided trips where you go to a place and somebody knows how to dose it and create what's called the set and setting. And two of them thought it was great. And then one of them did it on their own. It was horrible. I don't know if I'm going to do it. Daniel Gilbert is a psychologist at Harvard. Human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. The one constant in life is our change. And I thought that this was the case. That I was the same person when I was 30, when I was 60, and so forth. And then I retired. And my wife it comes from a big family. They have a house in Situate. So she was one of 10 siblings. And every July 4th is a gathering at the house in Situate, which has been in the family for 100 years. There are about 40 or 50 people who will show up with kids, grandkids, and assorted friends and pets. And so, anyway, after the last July 4th, I hear from my daughter that the second generation, my kids' generation, one of them voted me most improved, but it showed me that I really did change. The point is that I told you in the very beginning, there's this bridging identity. People are afraid to make the jump into retirement because they don't understand what they're going to do. And the problem is they don't know how they're going to change themselves. And it's a process. There's no right path. Some people will continue doing what they did. One of the guys in one of my retirement groups basically was a financial investor, and he basically continues to play on the computer every day with his own money, investing it. But many people break or move on from their prior experiences. The book that I mentioned earlier by the local professors, Retiring, will help you do that. But you can just Google, what is my purpose in life? How do I get there? Two last points: deliberative scheduling in retirement. When you guys are working, you are very busy. And when I was very busy, I didn't have time to get a cup of coffee, go to the bathroom. And retirement is exactly the opposite. If you don't schedule stuff on your schedule, you will find you have nothing to do. You have to make it a point. So every day I come down, I get my cup of coffee. I have a printed copy of my calendar right next to the coffee machine. I sit down with my computer, my coffee, and I look at the emails, things from MIT Club of Boston, advertisements from theaters. What do I want to add to my calendar? And you have to, and I made that a habit. And the reason I did it like that was habit. Most people don't follow through on habit, change their habits. 97% of people who make New Year's resolutions, they're gone very quickly. Jerome Groopman is a physician in the Harvard system, had a nice article in the New Yorker. And the way to make new habits or break old habits is to restructure the environment so it creates friction. So the old habit was hard to do. In my case, just putting the calendar next to the coffee machine was a very simple thing to do. Another example was I wanted to lose some weight. I couldn't do it. Turns out my wife was away for 2 or 3 weeks on a trip, and I decided I'm just not going to buy any food. And all I kept in the house was food that I didn't really like that couldn't do harm. So I had some apples in the house, maybe I had some eggs, but there was no junk food, there was no cereal, there was nothing that I really would just sort of sit and start eating. And I lost some weight. And ultimately, we came to an agreement of how we do it. And I don't know, maybe we have the junk food and she's hiding it, but that's fine. So you have to restructure your environment. So wrap up. Strategic retirement plan based on the data, supplement it with your personal interests and priorities. Then you create a tactical plan for each one of these things. If the tactical plan doesn't work, you reassess and you just iterate in. And this will be sort of an endless process. And remember, who you will be is not the same person as who you are. So don't be afraid to say, okay, just say yes to a new activity. I got a lot of essays on retirement. None of that is relevant. Um, I went in, as I said, it's now my time. So my son said to me, he lives in Napa with his wife and said, Dad, I want you to build me a birdhouse. And it's like, Calder, not going to do it. It's my time. I'm not interested in doing it. And he tried to guilt me in every way he could. It's only going to take 10 minutes. Calder's not going to take 10 minutes. I really want it. I'm not going to do it. And this went on for a while. Anyway, then our granddaughter was born, and he called me and said, well, what happens if Josie asks for a birdhouse? And what I wrote in my diary was when Josie asks for a birdhouse, um, I will have a conversation with her. We'll build it together. I'll give it to her and she can do with it as she wishes. But in my retirement, it's now my time. And for some people, that means taking care of their grandkids. But I'm only going to do what I really want to do here going forward. Looking back on my 2 years of retirement, I am definitely happy now and still healthy, and I feel fulfilled. So I think that just at least with an N of one, I think that justifies those my strategic retirement plan. And I'm going to keep doing this until it doesn't work, in which case then I'll iterate and make some changes. Um, I try to remember to just say yes. I don't always do it, but I try to do it because sometimes it's out of my comfort zone, but I know that that's the right thing to do. So with that, I don't really have anything else to tell you, and I'm sorry I ran over. Um, but if you have any questions, either here as a group or privately, I'm happy to entertain them. Thank you.